Julian Voss had lived on Larkspur Lane for 6 years before he ever spoke a full sentence to the man in the house with the blue door. That was the strange arithmetic of adult life, he'd come to realize. You could share a fence line with someone, wave at them over trash cans on Tuesday mornings, watch the seasons turn their maple tree from green to rust to bare, and still know almost nothing about them. Julian knew the man's name was Daniel. He knew there was a boy, maybe 7 or 8, who rode a bicycle with tassels on the handlebars up and down the cracked sidewalk in erratic, joyful loops. He knew that some nights the porch light burned until 2 in the morning, and that no one ever seemed to be awake to greet whoever it was staying up. He did not know that a woman had once lived there too, and that she didn't anymore, not because she'd left, but because she'd died, quietly, on a Tuesday in March, 2 years before Julian ever noticed the blue door at all. He learned all of this the way people learn most important things, badly, and out of order, starting with a knock. It was late September, the kind of afternoon where the light turned everything gold an hour too early, when Daniel Reyes stood on Julian's porch looking like a man who had rehearsed a request and lost his nerve halfway through delivering it. "I know this is strange," Daniel said. "You don't know me." "Not really. But I've got a shift that starts at 4 and my sitter just cancelled, and I have called every number in my phone, and you're the only person I could think of who might." He stopped, exhaled, started over. "I'm Daniel Reyes. I live at 114. "I know," Julian said, and then, because that sounded strange, added, "the blue door." Something eased in Daniel's shoulders, like being recognized was its own small kindness. "The blue door," he agreed. "Look, I wouldn't ask, except it's my son, Milo. He's 8, he's easy, he mostly wants someone in the house so he's not alone, and I would pay you, obviously, he shook his head. "You work from home. I've seen the lights on during the day. I thought maybe." Julian was an illustrator. He drew children's books about foxes who were afraid of thunderstorms and bears who couldn't sleep, and he did it from a converted sunroom that looked out over the very sidewalk Milo rode his bicycle down. He had, in fact, watched that boy loop past his window 100 times without ever learning his name. "I can do tonight," Julian said, because it was true, and because there was something in Daniel's face, not desperation exactly, but the practiced exhaustion of a man who had learned not to expect help and was startled every time it appeared, that made refusing feel unthinkable. "What time do you need me?" "Now," Daniel admitted, wincing. I know I'll owe you." "You won't," Julian said. "Go to work. I've got him." He would think, later, that this was the moment the story actually began, not the golden afternoon light, not the blue door, but the specific relief that broke across Daniel Reyes's face, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it had weight. Milo turned out to be, as promised, easy, in the particular way of children who have learned early that the adults around them are tired, and who have quietly decided to make themselves as little trouble as possible. He had his father's dark eyes and a gap-toothed seriousness that made him seem older than 8, and he regarded Julian with the frank suspicion of a boy who had met a great many well-meaning strangers his father brought in to help. "You draw the fox book," Milo said. "Not a question." He was standing in the doorway of his own living room, arms crossed, sizing Julian up. "The one with the thunderstorm." "I have it." "I did draw that one," Julian said, surprised and, he'd admit, a little pleased. "The fox looks scared in a good way," Milo said, which Julian would spend years afterward considering the single best review he'd ever received. "Not stupid scared. Real scared." "That's the idea," Julian said. Milo studied him another moment, apparently satisfied by this exchange, and then said, "Dad left spaghetti. You have to stir it or it sticks," and walked into the kitchen like the matter was settled. They ate at the small table under a window that looked out on the darkening yard, and Milo talked, about a book he was reading, about a kid at school who claimed to have seen a coyote, about the difference between real astronauts and movie astronauts, which he felt strongly people confused. Julian listened, asked the right small questions, and found himself unexpectedly moved by the boy's seriousness. his hunger to be taken seriously by an adult who wasn't performing patience. It was nearly 10 when Daniel came home, still in his uniform. Julian understood then that he was a paramedic, not a firefighter as he'd guessed, smelling faintly of antiseptic and cold night air, moving with the particular quiet of someone trying not to wake a house that might already be asleep. He found Julian on the couch, a half-finished sketch on his knee, Milo curled against his side, out cold. Daniel stopped in the doorway. Something crossed his face that Julian couldn't name yet, wouldn't be able to name for weeks, but that he would recognize, much later, as the specific ache of seeing your child safe and happy with someone new, and not knowing whether to be grateful or grieved that it wasn't you who'd gotten to see it happen. "He wore you out," Daniel said softly. "He's a good kid," Julian said, just as soft, not wanting to wake him. "He told me about the coyote." "Barry the alleged coyote," Daniel said, and something in his tired face cracked into a real smile. "Every kid at that school has seen Barry. I think Barry might be several golden retrievers and a trash bag." Julian laughed, quietly, so as not to wake the boy, and in the low lamplight, in the particular hush of a house that had gone soft with sleep, he looked up at Daniel Reyes properly for the first time. Not the neighbor across the fence. Not the tired man on the porch. Just a person, worn thin by a long shift, looking at his son with a tenderness so unguarded it felt almost private to witness. "Thank you," Daniel said. "Really. I don't know what I would have done." "Anytime," Julian said, and meant it more than he expected to. He didn't know yet that he'd said yes to something much larger than one evening. The arrangement, as these things do, became a habit before either of them quite decided to make it one. Daniel's schedule was erratic, 12-hour shifts that rotated without mercy, nights that bled into mornings, a sitter situation that had been fragile even before it collapsed entirely. Julian's schedule, by contrast, was his own to bend, deadlines, not ours, and a flexibility that felt, for the first time in years, useful to someone besides himself. So it became this, 2, sometimes 3 evenings a week, Julian would cross the small strip of grass between their houses and let himself in with the spare key Daniel had, after the second week, simply handed him without ceremony, like it was obvious this was where things were headed. He'd make dinner, or reheat whatever Daniel had made, and he'd sit with Milo over homework or bicycle tune-ups or increasingly elaborate debates about the astronaut question, and some nights, if Daniel's shift ended early enough, the two men would end up on the back porch together after Milo was asleep, talking in the low voices people use when they don't want to disturb a house at rest. Those porch conversations were where Julian learned the rest of it. He learned that Daniel's husband, Marcus, a name Daniel said carefully, like handling something with a hairline crack, had died of an aneurysm 2 years ago, on an ordinary Tuesday, in the kitchen, while Milo was at school and Daniel was on shift. He learned that Daniel had found out over the phone, in an ambulance bay, from his own co-workers, and that he had not, for a long time afterward, been able to walk into that kitchen without his chest going tight. "We repainted it," Daniel said one night, nodding toward the house behind them. "The kitchen. I couldn't tell you if it helped or if I just needed to feel like I'd done something." "Probably both," Julian said. Daniel looked at him sideways, something grateful in it. "Most people either go quiet or they say something about how he's in a better place. You just said probably both." "It usually is," Julian said. "Both things, I mean. Grief's not tidy like that." "No," Daniel agreed. "It really isn't." Julian, in turn, found himself telling Daniel things he didn't usually say out loud, about the boyfriend before, the one who'd called his work cartoons for babies until Julian had finally understood that contempt dressed as teasing was still contempt, about the particular loneliness of freelance life, the way a person could go days only speaking to baristas and mail carriers, about his mother, 3 states away, who called every Sunday and always asked, in the same gentle, worried voice, whether he was seeing anyone, as though being 34 and single were a diagnosis she was monitoring. "Are you?" Daniel asked one night, not quite looking at him. "Seeing anyone?" "No," Julian said. "Not in a while." Why not? Daniel asked, and then, quickly, sorry. You don't have to. No, it's fine. Julian turned his glass in his hands, considering. I think I got tired of dating people who wanted the idea of me more than the actual version. The actual version draws foxes for a living and goes to bed at 10 and cries at dog movies. Daniel laughed, low and real. I cried at that dog movie. The one with the... Don't, Julian said, laughing too. Don't say the title, I will start again right now. They sat there in the dark, laughing quietly at nothing and everything, and Julian felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet, a warmth that had nothing to do with the porch heater Daniel had switched on against the October chill, and everything to do with how easy it was, suddenly, to sit beside this man and say true things. He told himself it was friendship. For a while, that was even true. Milo, for his part, seemed to have quietly decided some weeks prior that Julian was a fixture, and had begun treating him accordingly, with the casual, unguarded affection children extend to adults they've stopped auditioning. You should come to the science fair, Milo announced one evening in November, not looking up from his volcano diorama. Dad's working. Mrs. Alvarez next door said she'd come, but she smells like mothballs and I don't want her standing next to my project. Milo, Daniel said, half laughing, half scolding, from the kitchen doorway. It's true, Milo said, unbothered. Will you come, Julian? Julian looked past the boy to Daniel, who had gone still in the doorway, dish towel in hand, watching this unfold with an expression Julian couldn't quite read, something careful, something hopeful, something that looked almost like held breath. I'd love to come, Julian said, and Milo grinned his gap-toothed grin and went back to his volcano, satisfied, as though the outcome had never been in doubt. Later, after Milo was in bed, Daniel found Julian in the kitchen, drying the last of the dishes. You didn't have to say yes to that, Daniel said quietly. I wanted to, Julian said. He's gotten attached, Daniel said, and there was something in his voice, not quite an apology, but close to one. Faster than I expected. I should've, I don't know. Managed that better. It's not fair to put that on you. Julian set down the dish towel and turned to face him fully. Daniel. I'm not here because I feel obligated. I like him. He stopped himself, aware of the edge he'd nearly walked over, and finished more carefully than he'd intended to. I like being here. Both of you. If that's all right to say. Daniel didn't answer right away. In the small kitchen, with its still new paint and the hum of the refrigerator and the late hour pressing in around them, he looked at Julian with an intensity that made Julian's pulse pick up before he understood why. It's all right to say, Daniel said finally, quiet. It's more than all right. Neither of them moved closer. Neither of them moved away. The moment held, fragile and charged, until Daniel cleared his throat and looked down at the dishes, and the ordinary rhythm of the evening reasserted itself, and Julian went home across the strip of dark grass with his heart going faster than the walk warranted, and lay awake a long time afterward, replaying a single sentence in his mind, it's more than all right, like it might mean something, if he turned it over enough times in the dark. Winter came in hard that year, the kind of cold that turned Larkspur Lane into a tunnel of bare branches and early dark, and with it came a rhythm Julian hadn't chosen exactly, but had somehow, entirely, come to depend on. He learned Daniel's coffee order black, too strong, an embarrassment of a mug collection he refused to explain. He learned that Daniel sang under his breath while doing dishes, badly, a habit he clearly didn't know Julian had noticed, and that Julian had started, without meaning to, listening for. He learned the exact quality of Daniel's laugh when something was actually funny versus when he was being polite, and found that he had begun, in small and increasingly reckless ways, working to earn the first kind. He learned, too, the shape of Daniel's grief, not as a single wound but as a low current running under everything, surfacing at strange times. A song on the radio. The particular blue of a winter sky that Marcus had apparently loved. The first snow, which Daniel stood at the window and watched with a stillness that Julian didn't interrupt, understanding somehow that it wasn't loneliness that needed company in that moment, but memory that needed room. He would have liked you, Daniel said once, apropos of nothing, watching that first snow fall. Marcus. He liked people who didn't perform for him. You don't perform. Is that a compliment? Julian asked, careful. It's the compliment, Daniel said, and didn't elaborate, and Julian didn't push, though he carried the sentence around with him for days like a stone in his pocket, worn smooth from handling. It was Milo, in the end, as it so often is children who say the thing the adults around them have been carefully not saying, who broke it open. They were in the backyard in December, breath fogging in the cold, trying and failing to build a snowman out of snow too dry to pack, when Milo straightened up from his lopsided base and looked between Julian and the kitchen window, where Daniel was visible, moving around inside, unaware he was being observed. You like my dad, Milo said. Not a question. Julian's hand stilled on the snow. I like your dad as a friend, bud. Milo gave him a look of such profound, ancient skepticism that Julian nearly laughed despite the sudden hammering of his heart. You look at him the way he used to look at Papa Marcus in the pictures, Milo said, with the terrible bluntness of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned that some true things are supposed to stay unsaid. I'm not mad. I just noticed. Milo. I liked Papa Marcus, Milo said, quieter now, and something in his small face had gone serious in a way that made him look, for a moment, exactly like his father. I don't remember him that good. I was little. But Dad sad a lot, even when he's smiling, and he's not sad like that when you're here. He shrugged, the enormous, casual shrug of a child delivering a verdict he considers self-evident. I just think you should know that. Julian knelt there in the cold, snow soaking through his jeans, absolutely undone by an 8-year-old's honesty, and didn't trust himself to speak for a long moment. Thank you for telling me, he finally managed. Are you going to do something about it? Milo asked, with the businesslike impatience of a child who has run out of patience for adult indecision. I don't know, Julian admitted. It's complicated. Grown-up things are complicated. Milo considered this, apparently found it an unsatisfying answer, and returned to the snowman without further comment, though Julian noticed, for the rest of the afternoon, the boy watching him and his father with a new and unmistakable attentiveness, the look of a child quietly rooting for something he'd decided he wanted. That night, after Milo was in bed, Julian found himself unable to leave. He sat on the porch step instead of standing to go, and Daniel, sensing something had shifted, sat down beside him without asking why. Milo said something today, Julian said finally, looking out at the dark yard rather than at Daniel. He does that, Daniel said, wary but gentle. What did he say? Julian made himself look over. He said I look at you the way you used to look at Marcus. The silence that followed was long enough that Julian's heart began to sink, certain he'd broken something, the fragile, easy thing they'd built these past months, by saying it out loud. Then Daniel exhaled, a sound like something finally, carefully, releasing. He's not wrong, Daniel said. I've been trying very hard not to look at you like that. I haven't been especially successful. Julian's breath caught. Daniel. I wasn't going to say anything, Daniel went on, quiet and a little unsteady, like a man crossing ice he wasn't sure would hold. You're in our lives because Milo needs you, and I didn't want to make that complicated, I didn't want you to feel like staying meant, like there was a cost to it, an expectation. There isn't a cost, Julian said. There's never been a cost. Daniel, I stopped coming here for Milo months ago. I mean, I still love him, that's not, I come here for both of you. I have for a long time. I just didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was asking for something you weren't ready to give. Daniel turned to look at him then, fully, in the porch light that had watched so many of their quiet conversations, and something in his face had gone open in a way Julian had never seen it, not careful, not guarded, just true. I don't know how to do this, Daniel admitted. I haven't, since Marcus, I haven't let myself want anything like this. It felt like it would mean something about loving him less, if I let myself want someone else. I know that's not how it works. I know grief doesn't work like a scale. But knowing it and feeling it are different things. I'm not asking you to stop loving him, Julian said softly. I would never ask you that. Milo carries him too. I'd never want to take that away from either of you. I know, Daniel said. I know that about you. That's part of why. He stopped, huffed a small, disbelieving laugh at himself. I've been rehearsing this conversation in my head for 2 months and I still don't know how to finish the sentence. Try, Julian said, barely above a whisper. Daniel looked at him a long moment, the porch light catching the uncertainty and the hope both, tangled together on his tired, handsome face. That's part of why I think I'm falling in love with you, Daniel finished. And it terrifies me. And I don't want to be terrified anymore. Julian didn't remember deciding to move. Only that one moment there was a careful distance between them on the step, respectful and aching, and the next there wasn't, his hand finding Daniel's jaw, Daniel's breath catching against his palm, and then the kiss itself, slow and searching and so gentle it felt like a question being answered rather than asked. When they broke apart, Daniel rested his forehead against Julian's, both of them breathing like they'd run somewhere instead of simply closed a small, impossible distance. Okay, Daniel said, a little wondering, a little wrecked. Okay. That was overdue, Julian offered. Overdue, Daniel agreed, and laughed, and kissed him again. Falling for someone was, Julian discovered, the easy part. It was the part that happened almost without his consent, in porchlight and bad jokes and the small ordinary miracle of being wanted by someone who'd stopped performing for anyone a long time ago. The hard part, the part no one warned him about, was what came after, learning to be loved by a man who was still, in quiet and unfinished ways, learning how to be loved at all. There were good weeks. Whole stretches of ordinary happiness that Julian hoarded like treasure, Sunday mornings with too much coffee and Milo's cartoons playing too loud, Daniel's hand finding his under the kitchen table for no reason except that he could, the three of them building an actual, structurally sound snowman in January that Milo named Barry, in honor of the alleged coyote, for reasons that made sense only to him. But there were harder weeks too. Nights when Daniel came home from a bad call, a child, once, that he wouldn't talk about for 3 days, and pulled inward instead of toward Julian, and Julian had to learn the difference between giving a grieving man space and being quietly shut out. Anniversaries that arrived without warning and knocked the breath out of a Tuesday afternoon. A night in February when Daniel, 3 glasses of wine past his usual caution, said, "Sometimes I feel guilty that I'm happy," and then wouldn't look at Julian for the rest of the evening, ashamed of having said it out loud. "You don't have to feel guilty with me," Julian told him that night, sitting close but not crowding him. "You're allowed to be happy. Marcus would want that. Milo wants that. I want that." "I know," Daniel said, staring at his hands. "Knowing and feeling, again." "I'm not going anywhere while you catch up to it," Julian said. "Take whatever time the feeling needs. I'm not on a clock." It was, he would realize later, the truest thing he'd ever said to anyone, and also the hardest promise he'd ever had to keep, because there were nights it would have been so much easier to walk the short distance home and stay there, to protect himself from a love that came, sometimes, with a grief attached that wasn't his to fully understand. He stayed anyway. Spring brought its own complications, not smaller ones, exactly, but different. Daniel's sister, Teresa, flying in from Arizona to finally meet this Julian, arriving with the frank, assessing warmth of a woman who loved her brother fiercely and intended to interrogate anyone who mattered to him. "He hasn't looked like this in 2 years, she told Julian bluntly, cornering him at the kitchen counter while Daniel and Milo argued cheerfully in the yard about the correct way to fly a kite. "I mean it. Not once. You did that. We did that together, I think," Julian said, careful, aware of how much weight the moment carried. He did a lot of it himself, honestly. Teresa studied him with her brother's same dark, direct eyes. Are you planning on sticking around? I'm not trying to scare you off. I'm asking because that little boy out there has already lost one father he loved, and I need to know if you understand what you're signing up for before this goes any further. The bluntness of it might have unsettled Julian, months ago. Now it only steadied him, because he had an answer, and it was true, and he didn't have to search for it. I understand, he said. And yes. I'm staying. Not because Daniel needs someone, and not because Milo needs a fixture. Because I love them. Both of them. That's not going to change because it gets hard sometimes. Teresa held his gaze a long moment, then something in her posture eased, and she smiled. Daniel's smile, Julian realized, the real one, not the polite one. Good, she said simply. Then welcome to the family, I guess. Fair warning, we're loud at Thanksgiving. By the time the maple tree outside 114, Larkspur Lane had gone gold again, a full year, nearly to the week, since Julian had first crossed the grass with a plate of reheated spaghetti and no idea what he was walking into. The arrangement of their lives had settled into something neither of them called temporary anymore. Julian's converted sunroom still looked out over the sidewalk, though these days it was less often empty. Milo had taken to doing his homework there some afternoons, sprawled on the floor with his volcano diorama ambitions now redirected toward increasingly elaborate solar system models, while Julian worked at his desk and answered astronaut-related questions with the seriousness they apparently required. The spare key Daniel had handed over so casually a year ago had, at some point neither of them could quite pinpoint, stopped being spare. You're basically already living here, Daniel pointed out one evening in October, watching Julian search, for the third time that week, for a jacket he'd apparently left at his own house across the yard. It might just be simpler. Julian went still, jacket forgotten. Is that you asking? Daniel came around the kitchen counter, unhurried, the particular calm of a man who had done the harder work already, the year of catching up to his own feelings, the year of learning that wanting Julian didn't diminish what he'd had with Marcus, only widened the room in his heart to hold more than grief. He took Julian's hands. I love you, Daniel said, simply, like it was no longer a hard thing to say, only a true one. Milo loves you. This house has felt like a home again since you started walking through that door, and I don't want to keep pretending it's temporary when it's the realest thing in my life. So yes. I'm asking. Move in. Officially. Take up a whole closet instead of half of one. From the doorway, unnoticed until that moment, Milo's voice piped up with the confidence of a boy who had, by his own account, seen this coming for a very long time. You should say yes, he informed Julian solemnly. I already made room in my room for your sketch stuff. I didn't ask, I just did it. It's already decided. Julian laughed, a real laugh, wet at the edges, looking between the boy who told him the truth on a snowy afternoon before either adult had been brave enough to, and the man who had spent a year learning how to want something good without apologizing for it. Well, Julian said, if it's already decided. It's already decided, Daniel agreed, and kissed him, and outside the window the porch light came on automatically as the evening settled in, the way it always had, the way it always would, no longer a light burning for someone missing, but one that simply marked, gently and without fanfare, a house that was, at last, entirely, unmistakably full. The science fair, this time, had a volcano in it after all, Milo's compromise, he explained with great seriousness, between the boring solar system thing everyone does and something that actually erupts. Julian stood at the back of the gymnasium beside Daniel, one hand tucked into his. Watching their son narrate the chemistry of baking soda and vinegar to a judge with the same unshakable confidence he'd once used to defend the existence of Barry the Coyote. He gets that from you, Daniel murmured, nodding toward the boy. The seriousness about ridiculous things. He gets the ridiculous things from you, Julian said. I'm just the seriousness. Daniel laughed, low and easy, the kind of laugh Julian had spent a year learning to earn and now got to hear, unprompted, several times a day. Across the gym, Milo caught sight of them and waved, not the automatic wave of a child performing for his parents, but a real one, bright and unguarded, the wave of a boy who had gotten, against the odds and the grief and the long careful year it had taken to get here, everything he'd quietly hoped for on that cold December afternoon in the backyard. "I just think you should know that," he'd said, 8 years old and entirely right. Julian squeezed Daniel's hand, and they crossed the gymnasium together to stand beside their son, and if anyone in that room had asked Julian, in that moment, how he'd ended up here, in a life he hadn't planned, loving a man he'd once known only as a wave over the trash cans, a boy who'd once been a stranger with tassels on his handlebars, he would have told them the truth. He came to watch the son. He stayed for the father. And somewhere in between, without ever quite meaning to, he'd found his way home.